The general understanding is that there is no legal obligation or right to consider rent relief. But why do you think landlords and tenants are pursuing it?
Jackie, I think that everybody on the call, being that they came here to learn a little bit about the rent relief process, is understanding that there actually might be a slight requirement, a legal obligation. I am not an attorney, and we'll talk a little bit about the team that you need to form in this process. And many people on the call have already formed a somewhat of a team and hopefully have talked with their attorneys. So I'm not going to talk on the legal side. But there certainly has been a moratorium on eviction, and there has been an ability for tenants to not pay in many jurisdictions. And this is a geography-based set of rules. And so depending on the city or county, and in certain states, you might have different requirements. But sitting around the table and coming up with a solution is something that's age-old. And the worst thing that can happen is that you end up with a vacant space. So the question being, why should you consider rent relief? It's because of those costs: vacancy, the cost to broker the new space, the TI improvements that might need to go in. And again, if we're talking residential, we're talking one set of rules and one set of costs, and we're talking office or industrial or retail, we're talking a whole set of other costs. Hopefully that gives you some insight into what you should be concerned about while you consider sitting down at the table.
It's important to consider that there's an incentive, economic incentive between landlords and tenants to get to the table, discuss this. We believe that that's the optimal solution for both parties. So there's this incentive to maximize your profits with your current situation. Right now, our environment is very unique. It's very uncertain. So the incentive to get on the table and start the discussion, it's the best option to get to an efficient result.
Thank you. Well, Craig, so based on your experience, can you share some of the key parts of the process that is important from an efficiency and legal standpoint?
So in regards to a process, I kind of look at rent relief as kind of like an M&A transaction. There's going to be a natural tension between tenant and landlord, where it's human nature that one's going to try to, without even knowing it, will try to one up the other and get some type of gain over each other. And that can be overwhelming for a landlord. And just the dynamics of it and the level of request could just become overwhelming. So I think therefore there needs to be an internal process in place that kind of creates consistency for the landlord for decision making that's scalable. And it also needs to be fair to the tenants, because you can just assume that various tenants are going to talk amongst each other. And if one got one deal, the other got the other deal, but the landlord doesn't really have a process that's well documented or well followed through, that could just be a recipe for disaster. And so a process that's consistent, scalable, and documented just could go a long way. The key is really to avoid one-offs, that a landlord may have a one-off deal with one tenant and not the other. And that's something you should stay away from. But if you have something that's well documented and a process that's followed, that could go a long way.
We don't have a crystal ball where this is going. In fact, the PPP loan money is running out. So many of those businesses that might have been able to continue to pay might start come knocking. And quite frankly, in residential real estate, we might actually see stimulus money drying up and those tenants coming. It's important that you think about what are you going to do when they come, and be consistent, like what Craig said. There were a few laws that actually got recently in the last week got stopped in legislature, including Scott Wiener's SB 939. And I know that a few of the landlords out there are probably fist bumping right now that didn't pass. I mean, there was a lot of opposition in that bill. And the result is that we have a little bit more time to have those real conversations and to structure the solutions in a way that leverages the original rules of engagement around leases. So I think that Craig's process he's talking about is something for you to have in place and ready and start having those conversations efficiently.
Absolutely. I would like to add a few comments to that. Completely agree that the process needs to be scalable, also repeatable, because following up your answer from the poll, just starting the webinar, where you have seen that most of you have been, your tenant has requested rent relief, it's going to be a little bit overwhelming. So there are a lot of balls out there in the air. The environment is very dynamic. So if you have a process that can actually identify and do the analytics for understanding what's the current situation for you as a landlord and also for your tenants, it will be just a little bit more easier to come up to a final decision, to an efficient decision, if you have the process in place to identify and to put on the table what are all the options available and what are the limitations that each party has.
Okay. And when you first talk to landlords to help them develop that process and just digest their current situation, Craig, can you think of any common issues or items that are often overlooked by landlords regarding their rent relief requests?
Yes, the most often overlooked items are, the tenants are providing data to the landlords to analyze, figure out solutions or potential solutions. And what's often overlooked is the validity and the accuracy of that financial information. And so if a landlord and the tenant are going to try to find common ground to come up with solutions, we got to go back to the basics and say, okay, well, is the information I'm getting from you, tenant, is it really accurate? And are they valid? So there's a big aspect of trust but verify that needs to happen. So decisions are made and you're using the right information to make the right decisions. And this need will change based on the sophistication of the tenant and the landlord. Some tenants may have great financial reporting, so it's easy to make decisions. Some may not. Some may have, poor financial statements and financial information that it'd be hard to do analysis on and make decisions. For example, we had a client where the city of San Francisco needed us to understand the financial health of a spin out of a Fortune 500 company, which wasn't publicly traded. So access to information was hard to get. And so our client needed us to get them comfort that they had the financial wherewithal and ability to complete a development. So it's things like that. It's just getting comfort of just a simple, are the financial information you're getting valid and accurate?
And on top of that, you want to make sure that you have the right decision-making team. And that decision-making team starts well in advance of these conversations. So structuring how you're going to request and digest and conclude on the information is important. Designing that process should involve your brokers for the specific geography and product type. It should involve your attorneys that also have that expertise. On the financial analysis side, it's one thing before a tenant moves into space to do kind of a standard credit check and feel comfortable about who's moving in. It's a different thing in the middle of a pandemic. So you want to make sure that whoever it is on your team, the decision-making group, actually has industry expertise, has the ability to look at levers in the economy, what might happen if there's another downturn, right? And all of that. So we are hoping that by the time these conversations are happening, you kind of have you're not using a gut reaction. And I like the poll showing that it's only 13%, I think, of the group had a formal process in place, because I think that's the case that we're finding with a lot of our clients. I luckily get to participate in a CFO roundtable call, and the same question was asked of the group, and pretty much the metrics and the decision making were kind of based upon rent collections. What is the recent history, and what are they going to do? I would call that an informal process. I mean, each one of them has a different approach. Anecdotally, we're hearing that in the market, the institutional groups have a fairly well-oiled process ready to go, but they're a little bit more slow in making a decision or offering relief options. And the small business owners, the mom and pops, the holders of real estate, may not have a formal process, but are more thorough with the discussion and might get more creative with the outcomes. It's important to have the right team in place when you get into it.
Okay, and depending on everyone's situation, what is the very first thing you would do if a landlord came to you and said, I don't trust these financials? What are the very first steps, Craig?
There's always a risk that a landlord is going to receive financials, but at the end of the day, they're just really numbers on a page. So, and again, this will vary depending on the sophistication of the tenant. But if, for example, you're just not getting a good gut sanity check, the first and simple thing you have to do is ask them to provide you the underlying transaction support. In our world, we call it the general ledger. Is from your accounting system, does the transaction level accounting agree or closely agree to the financials that you've been provided? We've seen numerous times where on the due diligence side during an M&A is potential sellers give potential buyers financials and financial statements in Excel, but not a system-generated financial statement. So ask for that system-generated financial statement, ask for that detail support, and also don't be afraid to ask questions. If there's some unusual fluctuations from one year to the next that doesn't make sense, ask the question. If you're looking at monthly data and there's unusual fluctuations month to month, don't be afraid to ask the tenant the questions of what's really going on. And if you're not getting the responses you want to hear, then maybe your gut feeling is correct. We've had examples when I mentioned numbers on a page, one of our clients engaged us, same thing. They weren't too sure about the financial numbers. They looked great. They were hoping they were correct because they looked fantastic, but just from a smell check, they just looked too good. And so our job was to figure out, okay, well, what generated these numbers? Because again, these financials were in Excel, and that's all we could get. And by the time we were able to get access to the actual accounting system generated financial information, they weren't even close. And so it was clearly that transaction didn't happen because the numbers that we found in the actual accounting system were not even close to what was provided to our potential buyer. Does it happen a lot? No, but it does happen. So it's just something to be aware of. Just if you feel not having a good gut feeling about your financials, just ask for, provide me the system-generated financial statements, provide me the underlying general ledger, and then ask simple fluctuation analysis. And if not, then you bring people like ourselves in to help.
So Craig, with respect to financials, we're familiar with what financials are, but specifically, in addition to general ledgers, are we asking for income statement? What type of, when you say financials, what are we looking for from a tenant? This is a question that's been asked.
I would ask for the income statement and the statement of cash flows. And then also actually in the balance sheet as well, because you want to see how much cash they have in the bank. So your simple financials are going to be your balance sheet, income statement, statement of cash flow, and then ask for a forecast. Right? That's another thing too, is if their income statement is here, but their forecast is here, or down here because they're trying to get lower rents, that's something you got to be aware of. That's a great question, especially with the forecast.
Yeah.
Does the forecast really make sense to what the company or the tenant has generated in the past or expect to generate due to COVID?
I think that's a great comment. Sorry, Mark.
I just wanted to point out that on our website, there is an example checklist that basically goes through the kind of detail that you should incorporate in that first request. And there certainly would be follow-ups, as Craig said.
Yeah, following up on Craig's comment related to the forecast, making that connection, that's very important. We need to understand, that's why it's important to have a process. The process will help us understand the financials. The financials are the reflection of the business, of the past, what has happened. But now that the world is changing, we need to have an understanding, link the forecast. And what the goal here is, if we're going to provide a rent relief option, we need to make sure that the tenant will recover in some way in the future, and we'll get back to a normal stage of the current business that we have. So the forecast needs to reflect now, what are these new changes or the what if scenarios on the economy? How fast will his industry will recover? What if there's a second outbreak of the pandemic? What if there are new government programs? All these what if scenarios need to be taken into account in order to explain if there's a big gap between the forecasts and the current financials. That will help make a better decision when it comes to the table and say, this is the right rent relief option for you.
All of this is data-based. All the stuff that Craig was indicating that needs to be received is only as good as somebody putting it up against some kind of a screen. And I think there's more to come.
Garbage in, garbage out. That's the